Welcome to Belmont Poetry Night. I'm Monica Korde, your host and the Poet Laureate of Belmont, California. We meet on the third Tuesdays of every month to celebrate the spoken word as makers, listeners, and admirers of poetry. We come with featured guests and an open mic, inviting readers of all ages. After gathering for several years at our favorite physical venue, the Belmont Library, since the pandemic, our thriving poetry circle has transitioned to this virtual space, and I'm grateful this allows me to welcome poets and listeners from across the globe. Great to see you all once again. Thanks for joining me and zooming in. As tradition goes, and most of you know it, I'd love to know where you are joining me from, so please share in the chat. And let's get going. Happy summer, everyone. What does the summer season remind you of? Put a word in the chat if you'd like to. For me, the word which springs to my mind is resting. And rest is not idleness always, or is it? I think it is a wonderful opportunity to disconnect, de-stress, and relax while finding time to recharge, reinvent, and rediscover yourself and the things that bring you joy. Needless to say, poetry is one of those joys for me and for most of us here, I think. So why not celebrate and curate a season of poetic forms, I thought. The theme for this month's Poetry Night is Summers, Sonnets, and Sestinas. And in your company, I wanted to revisit the formal traditional verse, relive the music, the measure, and the magic language holds, and re-experience the freedom that comes with restraint in the new formal poetry. To open the evening with, I'd like to share the same sonnet that I shared in my email announcement about this poetry night. Many of you who are on my mailing list who read the poem by Marilyn Nelson responded back to me saying how this piece fascinated you or moved you. And I just wanted to bring that feeling home, the feeling of deep connection and the power of poetry. So here it is. This poem by Marilyn Nelson is titled First Alzheimer's Sonnet. A wave enters the membrane labyrinth, and something mushrooms from nothing to now. Unacted on, thought disappears from sense like the vapor trail of a skeptic's awe. Look up. No trace remains. The road to hell is paved with good intentions once conceived of, twice forgotten in a micro-millisecond, cumulus lost on a breeze. What if, for a brief moment, the flame burns higher as a thought forms of you, my dear, then passes back into oblivion? Each cloud is a face of the atmosphere, as each wave is an aspect of the sea. Forget you? Never. Not while I am me. Thank you. If we take a look at this sonnet, though it isn't perfectly iambic pentameter, this contemporary sonnet alters the way we perceive a traditional form and enhances the poem's painful beauty through imagery. Just look at some of the imagery that it has. If you want to hear it again, membrane labyrinth, something mushrooms from nothing to now. Or this one here, which says, like the vapor trail of a skeptic's awe. It's just amazing, isn't it? And I wanted to share this poem again to see how it features a fascinating parallel between its thematic elements of thought and sense and the process embodied by the sonnet. So the asymmetry in the form also creates tension and a powerful force that pushes to break away and break free from the initially set patterns, but still keeping the movement of a sonnet from sensations to observations to thought, questions, and reflection. I happen to love formal poetry, and there's just something about a poet mastering a form or even sometimes breaking from it in a meaningful way that tends to make my words-loving heart sing with joy. And sing with joy it will throughout this night, because tonight we are in for a treat with another poet who has masterfully braided the traditional and the contemporary when it comes to writing formal poetry, especially. Taking our conversation on this season of poetic forms ahead, I'm honored to have Kathleen McClung as my featured poet tonight, and it is a pleasure to introduce her. Kathleen McClung is the author of 4 poetry collections, A Juror Must Fold In on Herself, winner of the 2020 Rattle Chapbook Prize, Temporary Kin, The Typist's Play Monopoly, and Almost the Rowboat. Winner of the Morton Marr, Maria W. Faust, and Rita Dove National Poetry Prizes, her work appears in a variety of journals and anthologies. From 2021 to 2023, she served as guest editor for The MacGuffin, a print literary journal based in Michigan. She also served as associate director of the Soul Making Keats literary competition and judged the contest's sonnet category. In 2018 and 19, she was a writer in residence at Friends of the San Francisco Public Library. Kathleen teaches literature and writing classes at Skyline College in San Bruno and directed the Women on Writing conference there for 10 years. She also teaches privately and at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in San Francisco. You can visit her website at www.kathleenmcclung.com. A warm welcome, Kathleen, and the mic is all yours.
Thank you so much, Monica. It is just such a joy to be here with you. And when you first invited me, I was completely delighted. I've had the deep pleasure of listening to your work in many readings over the years during the pandemic and on Zoom. And so when you contacted me to invite me to read this evening, I was just thrilled. So thank you so much for having me and bringing us all together to enjoy an evening of formal verse. I would love to start with 2 poems from my most recent chapbook, A Juror Must Fold In on Herself, which, as Monica mentioned, won the Rattle Chapbook Prize in 2020, which may have been the very best thing that happened for me during the pandemic. But to just briefly say, the chapbook grew out of my experience as the forewoman on a jury several years ago, before the pandemic, which was my first and so far only time on a jury, and a very emotionally challenging experience, because the case was a vehicular manslaughter case in which a child was killed by a driver. And after the trial was over, several months later, I wrote a poem about being a juror. And then I wrote some more poems. And I found the process of writing poems about that very challenging experience, I found the process to be soothing and healing. And I would suggest, we'll talk more about this, that writing formal verse can provide a form of soothing and healing in a complex world. So these first 2 poems come from my jury chapbook, and both of them are in the voice of a sequestered juror. And I was not sequestered during our trial, but I wondered what that would be like to be sequestered away from friends and family. So this first poem I'm going to read is called The Sequestered Juror Writes a Rondeau. You find yourself more grateful for the view than for the king-size mattress, because you don't sleep with any regularity. Instead, you rise and pull the drapes at 3 or 4 a.m. Bright parking lot is nothing new, and yet configurations change. Those two Toyotas just arrived. That powder blue Mercedes left. Praise flux, mobility. You find your cell expands beyond four walls by watching who emerges from each open door and who departs. One day you will conclude, guilty or not, deadlock's a possibility. One day you'll leave. For now, here's what you do. You fill your cell. And the second poem is titled, The Sequestered Juror Writes a Pantoum. And as some of you may know, a pantoum uses repeating lines throughout the poem. The sequestered juror writes a pantoum. It's no mystery where straight A's come from. You need a knack for following instructions. Sit up, pay attention, listen, and learn, your mother always said. The judge said, no talking, no research whatsoever about the trial. You need a knack for following instructions and watch documentaries about the solar system, but no news. The judge said, no talking, no research whatsoever about the trial. Only one juror at a time in the hotel pool, and watch documentaries about the solar system, but no news. The minibar is off limits. In fact, for you, it's a lunar landscape. Only one juror at a time in the hotel pool, and forget about those computers in the business center. The minibar is off limits. In fact, for you, it's a lunar landscape. Verdicts don't follow vodka. Vice versa, though, is common. And forget about those computers in the business center. No Googling that lanky prosecutor who doesn't wear a ring. Verdicts don't follow vodka. Vice versa, though, is common. And anything goes once this godforsaken trial ends next month. No Googling that lanky prosecutor who doesn't wear a ring until later. But even then, that could open a can of worms. Anything goes once this godforsaken trial ends next month. For now, a juror must fold in on herself. Until later. But even then, that could open a can of worms. In lieu of sleep or prayer or trance, there is, of course, poetry. For now, a juror must fold in on herself. It's no mystery where straight A's come from. In lieu of sleep or prayer or trance, there is, of course, poetry.
Oh, absolutely remarkable, Kathleen. And I love that you started with some of my new favorite forms. New, I say, because I only recently, a few years back, discovered them in a way, and the rondeau and the pantoum. And what great openings for both. I believe entering a poem in form is one of the initial challenges, and you do it effortlessly. And I would just like to quote and go back to each of your poems, just the big openings of the rondeau. You find yourself more grateful for the view than for the king-size mattress because you don't sleep with any regularity. I think it's such a ordinary thought in a way where it's very conversational, the way you begin, very casual, the tone and the conversationality of it is what I love. And even in the pantoum, as the pantoum begins, it's no mystery where straight A's come from. You need a knack for following instructions. And the repetitions in the pantoum, you've so masterfully executed them, crafting them, and how the judge asks you to maintain silence or listen to everyone. the repetition of it works so wonderfully in that scene of the courtroom you are creating. And I believe the sequestered juror poem series, all of them are part of your chapbook, as you said. So I love the real life as well as imagined subjects of your poetry, and I'll come to that. But to start our conversation with, I'd come across an interview of Marilyn Nelson's, whose poetry I just read in the opening, and the host had questioned one of the very common questions that they have for poets is, how early did you know you wanted to be a writer? To which Nelson responded, and I quote her, it was a toss-up between being a poet and being a doctor from about age 12 to about 18, when I realized that probably not everybody in my zoology 1A class was making up quatrains about meiosis and mitosis to study for the midterm. And I have the same question for you. How early did you know you wanted to be a poet? And how did you gravitate towards formal poetry?
Well, that's a great question. And the first thing that I want to say as I'm hearing about Marilyn Nelson thinking about being a physician versus a poet, I would say I thought quite a long time about being a lawyer. And I went through college, or at least started college, thinking that I would become a lawyer, and that I would go into politics, and that maybe I would be the first woman president one day. And that didn't happen. But I do think that my interest in law has a lot to do with why I wrote this book of poems about being a juror, because I found, the process of being a juror extremely fascinating, as well as emotionally very challenging. I've always known that writing was important to me from early childhood. I loved writing. I loved writing all types of poems and stories and plays. And I would share my work with classmates, and of course with my teachers in elementary school, and got just a lot of encouragement from my teachers. And so when I decided not to be a lawyer, after all, becoming a teacher made the most sense to me. And I've been able to be both a teacher and a writer, all of my adult life. And that was a really good decision. I'm glad that I wasn't a lawyer. There's a poem in the chapbook, the jury chapbook, in which I speculate about, if I had become a lawyer, I might have a backyard. As it is, I live in an apartment in San Francisco, which I love, and have no backyard. But I have friends who are lawyers, and we talk a lot about what that's like. And I'm very glad that I became a teacher.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful to know, Kathleen. And I think in the chat, Louise Moises mentioned that don't give up on the idea of becoming the president. It would be wonderful to have a poet as a president. So on that note, I wonder if you have any poems in the voice of a president, just like you have in the voice of a sequestered juror. Next, we might hear.
I don't think I have any poems in the voice of a president. I don't have in front of me a poem where I say something about, I contemplate going the Feinstein route. At one point, I thought about coloring my hair the way that Dianne Feinstein, our senator, colors her hair. And, I haven't gone the Feinstein route, but perhaps I will write a poem about in the voice of a woman president, and see what that would feel like.
Perfect. There, you have an idea now. And following up with that idea, and the question that I had was, when you approach an idea in form, who is the voice in your head?
I would say the voice in my head is a contemplative voice. I think what I'm doing in my poems is meditating or contemplating on whatever the subject at hand is, and in this case being a juror. So the voice in my head is one that that wants to be with the material, that wants to, dive deeper beneath the surface of the material and really contemplate what it means. And the it could be anything. It could be, the clutter in my apartment. It could be, a raccoon rummaging in the garbage cans. It could be, the death of a child on the streets of San Francisco and the trial that ensued. It could be anything. And poetry gives me the opportunity to slow down and contemplate. And so that voice in my head is that of now an aging woman looking at the world and what shimmers from what it is I look at. And I love having poetry at my fingertips to be able to do that. And it's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking that question, Monica.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think when you say poetry at your fingertips, I think it is a gift that you have, that you have that way of expressing your thoughts, and we are getting treated to all of that. But I also feel that the way you talked about the contemplative voice, I think it is very organic for you. And I was wondering whether you also put any kind of intentional, conscious choice of the voice as well, when you're getting into imagined subjects, for example, in the head of a sequestered juror, which you haven't completely experienced. But yeah, I was wondering whether you make a conscious choice as well when choosing the voice.
Well, yes, I do. In the case of the sequestered juror, I reached a point when I was working on the chapbook, and I felt maybe I had mined enough of my experience on this particular trial, and I felt that that there were jurors who had it worse than we did, and so I wanted to imagine that experience, and so I chose to imagine someone locked away, not able to read the newspaper, not able to be in dialogue with their loved ones, and I I do think that poetry is an opportunity to deepen our empathy for people, of course, similar to us, but also for people different from ourselves. And so I just thought, I'm going to see what comes up if I imagine what it would be like to be a sequestered juror. And I found it a really fascinating enterprise. And
It is, yeah.
yeah, so I love, I love when I teach poetry writing, I encourage my students to write persona poems, poems that are in the voice of someone other than ourselves. And that's, I find that, I've always found that just a wonderful activity to do, to walk in the shoes of someone, very, very different. I can remember writing a poem as a college student in the voice of a Macy's cosmetics department store clerk who was gray haired. And as a 19-year-old, I wondered, what would it be like to be a 65-year-old woman selling cosmetics at Macy's? And so I can remember writing this poem kind of in her voice, just imagining what that might feel like. And ever since, I've really loved writing persona poems and really encourage my students to do that as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Kathleen. I think that's a wonderful exercise in poetry writing as well, to do persona poems or just to get ideas on the page, or if there is a lack of ideas at all. But would love to hear a couple more poems again, the next two in your
Sure.
set, before we take a
Sure.
pause again.
Sure. Well, these next two I'd like to read are both sonnets. And I'm going to read a persona poem, sonnet. I wrote a series of sonnets, a crown of sonnets, which is 7 interconnected poems. And this crown was called bridge work because I spend a lot of time driving across the Bay Bridge between San Francisco and the East Bay. And because I'm on that bridge so often, I got to thinking, I'm going to write a series of poems about people affiliated with bridges, whether they're workers on the bridge or in this case, the poem is titled The Traffic Reporter's Retirement Speech. And I've never been a traffic reporter riding around in helicopters, but I wondered, what would that be like? So this is the traffic reporter's retirement speech. Indulge me, a lost art. You can't steer by my voice. Rush hour duet with helicopter blades. Each freeway snarl, bridge accident, relayed with poise, a muted empathy, plain words. Decades ago, they dubbed me Dawn O'Day. My uniform, a zippered gold lame jumpsuit, high heels, headphones. I learned to waltz with thunderstorms from Steve, who flew artillery across rice fields in Nam. I watched him, stoic, navigate each element, air, water, earth, to lift off, circle, land, but could not emulate my colleague. No, this shifting sky's a gift to praise, revere. The traffic, too, apologies, threats, alibis, songs, jokes, a masterpiece. And the second sonnet I'd like to read is based on an experience I had in Macy's. I don't shop in Macy's very often, but I went shopping for a bathing suit a few years ago and had this experience. So this is called For the Man at Macy's Lurking in Swimwear. Don't think I didn't notice you. I did. But that's your fervent hope to creep us out, we 50-somethings on our lunch breaks, mid-April, determination mixed with doubt. Our quest, acquire a bargain, flattering, dark, dignified, a hint of whimsy, though, a Helen Mirren suit for traveling to hotel pools, a beach in Mexico. But you, sir, crouching by the clearance rack, were in the way. A cone some road crew left behind. I steered around, bypassed you, but looked back and saw a loneliness I sometimes find in mirrors as I brush my teeth or drive. Awash in teal, the two of us, alone, alive.
So cleverly crafted there, Kathleen. Both of these sonnets, I love the way the movement happens in these pieces. And in connection with both the sonnets that you just shared, it kind of segues nicely into my next question, because I was thinking of the poems you write reflect a traditionalist sense of meter and prosody, but you breathe contemporary life into these traditional forms through quotidian observations and scenes, honoring the jobs and lives of people from the everyday. What I'm curious to know is, while practicing and mastering technique through writing in traditional verse, how important is it to experiment with forms? And I remember from one of your interviews, you said, there is no sestina police.
Exactly. Let me elaborate what I meant there. There are rules to writing formal verse. Sestinas have very elaborate rules, and I like the rules. The rules provide a structure that I can follow, and that structure, as I mentioned before, can be very, very comforting. And yet, I do feel it's important and necessary to deviate from the structure in service of the poem, so that the poem and what is happening in the poem is more important than the rules. And so when I say there's no sestina police, or there's no villanelle police, or there's no rondeau police, what I mean is, go for it. If you want to tweak the rules a little bit in service of the poem, then do it, to make a better poem, a stronger poem. And so I definitely encourage deviation and experimenting, from the traditional. And now, for example, the sonnet is a form that all kinds of folks are deviating from in all kinds of ways, and enlarging the sonnet form in wonderful ways. My good friend Grace Grafton has a book called Whimsy, Reticence, and Laud, Unruly Sonnets, which I love. I love the concept of unruly sonnets. They're sonnets that aren't following all those rules, but they're amazing. They're wonderful. They lift us. They bring us tremendous joy and tremendous inspiration. So I use that phrase a lot. There is no sestina police and there's no sonnet police. And I like when I see deviation, and I like it when my own work, veers off a wee bit from the rules. Yeah.
Right. But I also feel that you can only do it when you also know you are really well versed with the rules, and then you break away from them in a very meaningful way, like we were talking about earlier. And
Yes.
when I talk about experimentation, how does a poet who is trying to get into it, or trying to devise new ways of entering a sonnet or a sestina, for example, is there a limit to how many rules you can break? Or is there, because like you said, sonnet is really enlarging and people are doing it in creative variety of ways. How do you know which one is the right way, especially if you're entering a contest, for example, like the Soul Keats making contest? How do you know
Mm.
this will be approved as a sonnet?
There is no hard and fast way of knowing. I think that one has to reach a place in one's own writing life where one feels comfortable deviating. And so when one is first starting, for example, writing sonnets, I would recommend, sticking to the rules, and of course reading lots and lots and lots of sonnets that follow the rules, and reading those that don't follow the rules, and just writing lots of them. And when entering a contest, I have greatly enjoyed judging contests, the sonnet contest for the Soul Making Keats, and I'm currently reading for the MacGuffin's Poet Hunt. I can tell as a judge when a poet I can just tell when a poet is very experienced with the form that they're working in. It's something I can intuit, and I can tell when a poet is new to the form. Um, and it's kind of like, back to the doctor analogy. A new doctor often follows the lessons that doctor learned in medical school to a T, And as that doctor has more and more experience treating more and more patients over her career, she may, deviate a little bit from what she learned in medical school. And she may, try something slightly different. And the same is true for poets. When we first start our poetry practice, we want to like do the right thing in the right way. And then as we develop more confidence and more of a sense of, oh, I could do this instead, then that emerges. So I hope that answers your question, Monica. It's a really great question.
Absolutely, Kathleen. And I was also asking this question because I have done this myself where I'm trying, since I love traditional forms, but I don't want to uh, have the rigidity of those forms and see how I can be flexible with it and still be as organic with the content of it. And I have
Yes.
very often I sit down with books or poems that are available online of local poets around. And I remember sitting down with your rondeau while I was trying to create a rondeau myself, just to see how you are breaking away from the rules. And I was reading about the rondeau specific rules that it follows and the pattern that it has, and how you are distancing yourself from it in some ways, but still it is still a rondeau, and taking shape beautifully. So I think for me, what also works is following in the steps of a certain poet you really admire or you really enjoy their work, those who are doing this kind of work of breaking away and trying something new. So
Mm.
I think it is a wonderful way to experiment with your own craft as well.
Yes, definitely,
Well,
definitely.
on that note, would love to hear your next two poems.
Okay, sure. How about two sestinas? And a sestina is a longer form than the poems I've read so far. But it's a form I love, I dearly love. And so this first sestina I'm going to read comes from the Juror chapbook. And it's not about being a juror. It's a poem about my father, who has passed away. But I think it becomes clear what the poem is about. It's a poem honoring the complexity of his life.
And
It's
sorry,
called
Kathleen, before you
Yes,
start off with the poem, one
yes.
request, if it is possible at all. I think one of the sestinas you would be also offering is Behind the Wheel.
That's the one I was about to read. Would you like me to not read that one or a
No,
different one?
I mean, is it possible for you to hold on to it until our
Sure,
presentation?
sure. Oh,
So
sure,
I would love people to have a visual of it as well while you're
sure,
reciting it. So
sure.
since
So
of
I'll save that
Sestina
one.
is really long, I think it would be wonderful to stay with your poem on the page and on the ears as well.
Sure, no problem.
Thank you
Then
so
I'll
much.
switch gears to read a different sestina, if that's okay, Monica.
Yes,
And
yes.
this one is called Threshold, and Threshold comes from my chapbook, my first chapbook, Almost the Rowboat, which came out in 2013. And this poem is set in San Mateo County, and it's about driving to Half Moon Bay. So this is Threshold. For time alone to think, she drives Highway 1 south past Half Moon Bay. She seeks the thrift store in Pescadero, perhaps a glass of wine in Davenport. She's parched. She needs the still spring day flooding through the car window, the colors of ocean, sky, hills, blue, blue, green. A tenant, an urban woman craving more green than what she spies at 7 when she wakes, one slim, timid tree planted by a city worker near her window. She admires this civic blend of generosity and thrift. She blesses the roots snaking beneath the sidewalk. Still in the evening, as she unties her shoes, pours wine into a Goodwill goblet, she knows her wine can never satisfy her thirst for green. Her Safeway Cabernet can never still her yearnings. For what? To feel at one with nature, with the divine? Thrift only goes so far, more a keyhole than a window. She drives the sinuous road then, quiet, her window pulling surprises inward, faithfully, in ways that wine cannot. A destination as good as any, the thrift store beside the road sobers her from green inebriation, slows her imbibing of sky, ocean, hill. One elixir unbottled, unlimited, swift moving, stone still. She steps from car to parking lot, stands still to read the sign, scotch taped to store window. Wednesday special, everything 2 for 1. What day is this? She swims in a lapse, as wine may genially spill, then comes ashore. Ah, yes, green letters on her wristwatch read, wed. And her thrift doubles suddenly. With each tick, 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 her thrift expands, balloons. It nearly lifts her off her feet, still bending her left arm. But no, she's grounded by the green grass of Pescadero, the 5 daffodils beneath the window of the store, jaunty daredevils teetering as if tipsy on wine. She laughs. The breeze dies down. It's 15 minutes after 1. Still charmed, she crosses the threshold of the thrift store. She may choose a green blouse by the window. Her free one, her gift, may be red, like raspberries, like wine. And maybe I'll read a villanelle. Would that be something to do?
Absolutely,
How
Kathleen. Thank
about
you.
um, I think I'll read this poem called Across and Down. And Across and Down is a poem dedicated to my father's little brother who died at age 3 from scarlet fever. And this is a poem about my grandparents grieving the death of their youngest child. And my grandmother enjoyed crossword puzzles, so that's why it's called Across and Down. Across and Down. He smoked a pipe and read the Mercury, but saved the crossword page for her. At dawn, she wrestled with small numbered squares. Her poetry, her home, 3 sons, 2 daughters, a family she made with George. She could depend upon him, smoking pipes and reading. Mercury winked out beside the moon each day as she put water on to boil and wept for her son, John. She wrestled with small numbered squares, half-heartedly, in a half-dark bungalow, until, hungry, 4 children woke. One flipped the light switch on. George smoked a pipe and read. Both Mercury and scarlet fever, gods of thieves and trickery, had flown through every house, and paused, then gone. She wrestled with small numbered squares. No poetry they read in church, no hymns they sang off key could bring full light. They kept the curtains drawn. He smoked a pipe and read the Mercury. She wrestled with small, empty squares. Her poetry.
Well, that was exquisite, Kathleen, and thank you so much for taking in the request of holding on to the particular sestina. I hope you didn't mind. I stopped you for sharing for now.
No, not at all. Not at all.
But
no problem.
I'm really glad you actually shared two different forms, the sestina and the villanelle as well. So we have almost heard most of the forms that you're offering tonight. And one of the poets I was reading before, a Canadian poet, and also who was the poet laureate of Newfoundland, George Murray, when he was talking about the sonnet, and I think it is also true for many other forms, is that you think of a sonnet like a bundt pan, he said. You can make a wide array of recipes in it, but it will always look like a bundt cake when it comes out. And taking the analogy of baking and formal poetry, I'd like our audience to have a visual feast of forms. One needs to see how a cake is made from scratch and understand the process to know the work that goes behind it and truly savor it. So I'd like to share a short presentation I have prepared here. Let me just take a minute here and go ahead and share screen. There it is. I hope everyone can see it all right. Okay, so I have a little information on some of the sonnets, and I was thinking that we can hover over some of the sonnet forms that you've shared with us here, and especially you've masterfully crafted each of them. And in the time we have, I'd love to go over all of them, of course, but maybe we can focus on three forms here. So looking at the sonnet, the villanelle, and the sestina. If you can share one distinct trait of each of these forms and tell us what do you hope to reveal in these forms. Maybe we can take a look at the sonnet first. And typically, most of us are aware of the definition of a sonnet made of 14 lines and ending with a couplet. But if I just read the definition aloud here, traditionally, the sonnet is a 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter, employing one of several rhyme schemes and adhering to a tightly structured thematic organization. The name is taken from the Italian sonetto, which means a little sound or song. And most of them, we have always heard of sonnets as love poems, love songs, or in praise of something. And I'd love to know, you mostly, I think, write in the Shakespearean sonnet form, the English sonnet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I do mostly write Shakespearean form. And that's, I think, because I've spent over 20 years teaching Shakespeare sonnets in community college. And, for many students, Shakespeare is his work is very challenging syntactically, in terms of vocabulary. I always say scholars are unsure who Shakespeare's love interest was exactly. Was it a woman? Was it a man? Was Shakespeare bisexual? My students are, oh, maybe Shakespeare was bisexual, and that sort of, their ears kind of perk up a little bit more. And so I think I started writing sonnets. I think in some ways I started writing sonnets to kind of show my students that while I'm in the heritage of Shakespeare, I can write about, ATM machines or traffic jams or Facebook, or, anything that is existing now in the 21st century. I can write about material now and use Shakespeare's form, these 14 lines, using the rhyme scheme that Shakespeare used, using iambic pentameter, which is essentially, the beating of the heart. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. There's something about that meter that is just, it's rooted in the human body. And I'm a woman in the 21st century. Shakespeare was a man in the 16th century, but we both had a beating heart, and we both use words to explore what is around and within us. And I think that's why I started writing the sonnets that I did. And I love the 14 lines. They're just a little jewel, a little song. You have to get in, you have to get out, and say something that kind of echoes afterwards. So that's why the sonnet appeals to me.
Right, right. And I also feel at the same time that over the years, we have heard of these traditional sonnets by Shakespeare, which has, I think, in some ways or the other, watered down our view of the sonnet, how we perceive the traditional form as, which seems to be very meticulous and rigid in its way. But if we take a look at the poem that you shared, and I have it here in front of us, for the man at Macy's lurking in swimwear. I'd love to know the question that I was asking. What do you hope to reveal in the form when you're employing sonnet as a form to share this idea or express this thought you've had?
In this case, I'm choosing to write a direct address to someone that I will never actually speak to, but using the form of the sonnet, the beating of the heart, the rhyming, that final couplet, I find, using the Shakespearean form and having to have lines 13 and 14 rhyme with each other, kind of, those last two lines have to really dovetail or be in sync. And in this particular poem, I'm writing to a man who, I found it really weird that this guy was like lurking in the women's swimwear department, and I had no idea why he was and what that was about. But I chose to accentuate his loneliness and to kind of bring up, my own loneliness, and hopefully, all of us have a kind of loneliness at times. And so those last two lines where I say, I sometimes find in mirrors as I brush my teeth or drive. And then in the final line, I kind of bring us together, awash in teal, the two of us alone, alive. I literally, bring us together in those last two lines of the couplet. And so I think that the sonnet was a good form for that material of me writing to this man that was in Macy's.
Absolutely,
And
I hear you. And I also feel the way you talked about sonnet working as a way to get in and get out quickly. And I feel it is the same when we are observing things. We are in that moment for a very brief time, and we are not dwelling into that moment for too long. So here it seems really wonderful how the sonnet works really well and complements the thought, because I can't imagine a pantoum for the man at Macy's lurking in swimwear, having those repetitions. I think I don't know how much the repetitions would make sense in that manner.
yeah, I agree. That would I don't think I would do that.
Well, all right. Let's take a look at the next one, the villanelle. We just heard one of your villanelles. which was amazing. I'll read the definition of a vinylin first. A French verse form consisting of 5 three-line stanzas and a final quatrain, with the first and third lines of the first stanza repeating alternately in the following stanzas. These two refrain lines from the final couplet in the quatrain. And all of you can see, as an example, we have one of the very famous poems by famous villanelles by Elizabeth Bishop. The villanelle is called One Art. And the highlighted lines that you see in there, those are basically referring to the pattern that is put here in a certain format, A1, B, A2, A, B, A1. And I think this technicality of how the villanelle comes together, I was looking at the NY Times website, wherein they have a very interactive way of learning more about this sonnet. And it, as you scroll further on, it just highlights different portions of it and takes you through the whole villanelle, how it works, and thematically, and how it becomes more meaningful. And as it says here, there is something magical about villanelles. They can't be made to sound conversational because of the repetitions they contain. They have an incantatory quality, at times obsessional and haunted. Do you agree with that, Kathleen?
Yes, there is definitely an incantatory quality. The lines that get braided throughout, repeated throughout, you know, when the poet selects her lines, she has to know that those lines are going to be repeated. And so they have to have a kind of uh, a vividness to them. And again, here in the villanelle, it's very, very important to feel that you can deviate a little bit. In a villanelle, tweaking a word here or there is really almost essential, because you know, repeating these lines verbatim exactly as they are would make for a very very stilted, kind of tight poem. And so I would say, you know, the villanelle is a really challenging form. And if you're just starting out writing villanelles, be extremely patient with yourself. Read lots and lots and lots of villanelles. There are anthologies of villanelles you can, you know, get and read, and just read lots of them and see how writers have played with those braided lines so that the poem, you know, moves and isn't sort of frozen or stuck.
Right.
I love the villanelle form, but it is an extremely challenging form. Yeah.
Well, I think you've really worked with the form so well, and I have this villanelle in front of us by you, For the Man at Cape Arago with a Small Lacquer Box. I believe you haven't read it for us yet. Kathleen, do you think you would like to take us through it
Sure,
now,
sure,
as people
sure,
are looking
sure,
at the text
sure,
as well?
sure, sure.
Thank you.
This was a poem I wrote. Cape Arago is on the Oregon coast, and my partner and I took a trip to Oregon years ago, and we saw this man who had a small box. And so this was what I wrote when we got back from the trip. For the man at Cape Arago with a small lacquer box. We three share a vista point above the blue Pacific waves. A balm, this Oregon coastline, stones, surf, sunlight, turns. Faithful and new, this seascape hushes chatter, while the two of us watch you aim a lens at Douglas fir, at pine. We three share a vista point above the blue, but do not speak. We wonder what or who might be inside your carved box, polished fine. Stones, surf, sunlight, turns, faithful and new. Were they beloved by someone else? Have you brought ashes here? One day, who will bring mine? We three share a vista point above the blue. A stranger, Tom, and I. Below, a few seals bark. One more language we can't define. Stones, surf, sunlight, turns, faithful and new companions in our minds. We may review them as we sleep. The box may open, shine. We three share a vista point above the blue. Stones, surf, sunlight, turns, faithful and new.
Wow, that is incredible, Kathleen. And one of my questions was also about how so much of your work is formally rendered. But if we move beyond these traditional verse forms, you also write poems in free verse and ekphrastic poems as well. And you engage with other genres like the memoir, the fiction. And given these varied experiences as a writer, how has your relationship to form evolved over the years?
That's a great question. How has my relationship with form evolved? I, as I mentioned before, I find form to be, a comfort. And I find that, when I first started writing in form, I was, as I mentioned, really looking to Shakespeare, looking to Elizabeth Bishop, the people who write in form that I greatly admire, and I wanted to, try my hand and see if I could do sort of what those geniuses were doing, and I found the more I write in form, the more I'm able to really get at material that I might not have gotten at writing in free verse. You had used a really interesting phrase in the introduction to this evening's event, Monica, when you said that there's a freedom that comes with restraint. And I think that is so true. There is, when you're working with restraint, like with this villanelle form, you've got these patterns, there is a freedom to explore very complicated emotional material that I might not be able to access if I'm just writing in free verse, just because there's so many ways to go about it. But if I have the restraint, if I have the structure, the the kind of the rules, but I can bend the rules, it gives me latitude to tackle material like wondering, wow, after I die, who's gonna scatter my ashes? That question, is a tough question to grapple with. And I think in the course of working on the villanelle, that question arose, and I'm really glad it did. And I'm really glad the villanelle gave me the restraint that I needed to get at some really, I think profound questions about, life and death in this case. Yeah, and I think of form as giving me opportunities to go places internally that I might not be able to get to without that form.
Right. I hear you, Kathleen, and I feel much of the same when I'm thinking of writing poems in form, or when the mind seems too chaotic or things around seem there's a lot of noise around. I think there is a kind of solace I feel when entering a poem in form, or entering an idea in form, and then you can always find ways to break away from it. You always know whether the poem works or not, and but I think just that way of getting into the head of the multiple things that you carry within, it's a great way to express yourself. Let's take a look at one of the final forms in our presentation here, sestina. As you can see on the page, along with the definition, even the diagram, the visual presentation of it looks complex to me. The Sestina is a complex 39-line poem featuring the intricate repetition of end words in 6 stanzas and an envoi. So if we look at the lines over there, a poem of 39 lines with 6 stanzas of 6 lines each, followed by an envoi of 3 lines. Lines are unrhymed and contain the same 6 end words in each stanza, but in a changing order that follows a set pattern. The envoi, last 3 lines, gathers up all 6 end words. And I think when I think of the sestina, it is definitely one of the most challenging forms. How do you enter into a form like this, Kathleen? And also, I'd like to know, when you're thinking of a poem asking for its own architecture, what do these chosen forms achieve that others would not?
Yeah, the sestina, I love the form of the sestina. It is an extremely challenging form because they're like the villanelle, you're repeating lines. In the sestina, you're basically repeating words. And the words get repeated in a different pattern in every stanza, the end word at each line. And so I find the sestina a really great form to explore material that has a kind of an obsessive quality to it. Like I'm like sort of I tend to ruminate just in general, but the sestina is a form for, in a lot of rumination, kind of, okay, do this in this stanza and ruminate differently in this stanza and then ruminate differently in this stanza, but stick with those 6 words and see where the words take me. So when I choose to write a sestina, the most important component is choosing 6 words that will take me in interesting places and interesting directions. And, I will begin a sestina with a vague sense of what I'm going to be writing about, but I have no idea where the poem is going to take me. And I love entering into the sestina and letting the sestina take me somewhere. It is like getting into a little boat and letting the boat take me someplace. And so I always try to choose 6 words that I can do a lot with, that will take me in interesting ways. And I choose words that I don't have to stick to exactly. I've used this analogy before, or example before. I don't choose a word like rhinoceros, where you have to just keep using rhinoceros over and over and over again. I might choose a word like bored, because you could use bored as in like, oh, I'm so bored right now, or, oh, there's a dart board I can toss darts at, or I can cut a board of wood. Right there's 3 different ways to use the word bored. And so I think the sestina appeals to me because, yeah, there are limitations and this pattern, but I can kind of wiggle around, dance around, and do interesting things within that pattern. And then I've been really happy with each of the sestinas that has finally emerged. And the emphasis is on the word finally, because you can't rush a sestina. There are some sestinas I've worked on for months and finally finished. I've never written a sestina in less than a few weeks. It's something I really have to be patient with. And so in that sense, it's a meditation. It's a reminder to just go slow, don't rush, let the poem take me somewhere.
And does it such a complex form like the crown of sonnets or sestina or villanelles that you asked to be more patient with, does it still feel like work? Is it tedious, or does it still feel like play?
Mostly play. And when it feels like work, I stop. When it feels like this is not going anywhere, this is not working for me, I stop and I go, you know, do something else, like eat chocolate or something.
Well, we on
Um,
that note, I think we'd love to hear the sestina we've been
okay,
waiting for.
sure, sure. Okay, so yeah, this is a poem I wrote about my father, um, called Behind the Wheel. Our monthly ritual. He'd ask about my cat, uncork a bottle, pour us each some wine, Merlot. I'd curse the traffic on the drive, I-80 East. My father wasn't bored. He'd nod, say, never tailgate, stay safe, rotate your tires, change your oil. He'd ask about my 401, my landlord. Ask, what did the vet advise about old cats' hairballs? He'd show me articles he'd saved, websites and blogs he liked. He poured more wine and reminisced. 2 terms on the school board, his office, business trips. Sometimes we'd drive to Jackson, play poker machines, then drive back from the hills, still talking poker as the sun sank. Blue lights bloomed on his dashboard, and twilight blurred the road. He swerved for cats, and once some wild turkeys, their feathers wine-colored, their strutting slow. He kept them safe. A cop arrested him one night, unsafe, erratic weaving in a lane while driving home from chess at Duffy's bar. More wine than usual, more checkmates too. I never asked how many games he lost, too delicate a point to probe. My father liked the board at Duffy's in the back, below the old dartboard that no one used. A quiet tavern, safe, no brawls, just chess and fondness for a cat named Stubb who slept between the kegs. The drive from Duffy's 8 quick blocks. He didn't ask to call a cab. He dozed in jail and paid the fines, apologized in court. The judge liked wine and chess as well, perhaps. She wasn't bored or cruel, just firm, assigning Dad the task of office help, SPCA. They saved a few, he told me. Their spring kitten drive, a big success. He typed cage cards for cats and dogs newly arrived. His fingers swift on sleek keyboard. He saved to the hard drive. Old cats are like fine wines. Ask any volunteer.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for taking us through that craft talk and this poetry as well. I think it's such a dense form as we can see it on the page, and I really admire and I'm always in awe of how a poet can work so much into one poem, and there's so much to see. Just like you said, you can't rush a sestina. I think I wouldn't want to rush you either, and the time we are taking today, I think I'm so honored and privileged to have this conversation with you, and I'm sure all of the poets listening to us tonight are really enjoying this conversation, some of whom are poets in the house and who have also worked on form with you as students before. One of my final questions as we come towards the closing of the segment here is that you've been teaching poetry for a long time now. I'd love to hear about your writing pedagogy. How has it developed over time? And do you believe it's important for poets coming up now to learn form?
There's a lot to say in that answer to that question. I would say that as a teacher of poetry, I really honor every person's journey. Every person has their own journey. Every person has their own material they're going to be exploring, their own um, tones, their own emphases. And my job as a teacher is to encourage them to take risks and to try new things. And so if, for example, a poet, writes a lot in free verse, and that's their preferred way of expressing themselves, that's great. I might say, hey, maybe give formal verse a try, give it a whirl, see what it's like to write a sonnet. But I certainly don't force form onto anyone. Form is not everyone's cup of tea. And so my job is to encourage people to to take their work to the deepest places that they can take their work. And my job is to expose people to new ways of writing poetry, and maybe a little nudge to try something different, but to really honor every person's path as a writer. And I have the great good fortune of working with writers at all ages and all places in life. Many of my students at Skyline are young teens, high school students through their 20s and into their 30s. And those folks are writing the work of young people. And I also have the great good fortune of working with mature writers, people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, some of whom might be on this Zoom today, who are exploring their material. And my task is to accompany each writer on their own path, and just encourage them to keep traveling and trying new things and going to new places. And it's just a joy to be a teacher of poetry and to see people's development. And it helps me keep growing and keep developing as a writer and as a person. So I hope that answers your question, Monica.
Absolutely, Kathleen. Thank you so much for sharing that wisdom with all of us. And I love the humility in you that talks about keeping on learning and keeping on with this act of learning while also being a teacher of it, which I think is so integral to for something like poetry, especially. Of course, all aspects of life, but for poetry, it truly brings so much meaning. And I'm just enthralled by all the offerings that you've made. A true feast of forms. That was really formidable. And the play on words is intended when I say formidable. Truly, the way you work with forms is ingenious. The poet Matsuo Basho once said that, in my view, a good poem is one in which the form of the verse and the joining of its parts seems light as a shallow river flowing over its sandy bed. And listening to you and sharing this conversation with you has been such an honor, very inspiring. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for being here and making this rich offering.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's poems during the open mic, and thank you all for being here. And it's just an intense pleasure. So thank you to all of you. Thank you.
I'll open up the floor briefly for questions, comments from the audience before we close this segment. So I encourage you to unmute and share. And as you do that, Please also look for some links to Kathleen's work that I'll be posting in the chat.
Hello, Kathleen. Thank you. This was a marvelous evening. I must say that looking at the form of the sestina and then looking at it written and read on the page bore no resemblance whatsoever, but I'm sure they do when broken down. And real quick, because I know other people want to get in, if my wife knew who was on tonight, I think she'd want me to say hello, which is Barbara Daly, who
Oh, hello,
worked
Barbara.
in the library for years and years. And so
Wonderful.
I'll see you
Yes,
in a
please
class.
give her my best.
I will do so.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yay. Yay, yay.
I just wanted to say how grateful I am to Kathleen and to Monica for this outstanding evening. It's been educational. It's been stunning to hear the poetry. And Kathleen has always been a great mentor and a teacher for me through quite a few years. And Monica, thank you so much too. And it's delightful. I'm sorry I have to leave, but it was a wonderful evening, most enjoyable. Thanks again.
Thank you, Elise. Elise Kazanjian. Yay, Elise. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Elise is one of my favorite people to know on the planet. I tell people I want to be Elise Kazanjian when I grow up. So thanks for being
I
here,
always
Elise.
say I want to be Kathleen McClung when I grow up. Yeah, so thank you and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Elise, for being here.
Thank you.
Anyone else would like to say something? There's a lot being said in the chat and so much that has connected with people with your poetry. Yes, Toby.
I'll say something. I think the really wonderful thing, well, one of the really, not the really, but one of the really wonderful things about Kathleen's poetry is that the form doesn't catch you up, so you're waiting and listening and thinking, oh, there it is, or it sounds a little, pushed, or like she reached for it. It has a really natural, it's a very natural flow and structure, so that you know it in your bones, and you notice it if you're alive to form. But people could listen to some of her poems and not know the form is there, or not know that she's using that, and feel that she's speaking in a very natural voice. And that's something that the great poets of form are able to do. Not all of them. I think Lowell, for instance, who's definitely a poet of form, is very noticeable, and he wants it to be noticeable. And somehow it's my feeling. But this has I just love that about her formal poetry. I mean, so you're hearing a voice that flows naturally into these rivers, these currents, and it's very beautiful.
Thank you, Toby. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I do feel I want to talk about the stuff that, I look at and wonder about, and that troubles me or that haunts me in some way here in 2023, and, living in this 63-year-old woman's body. And I want the poem to really, I love that it has that, as you say, natural feel to it. That's really important to me. And the form is, as I said, it's a thing for me as a thinker, writer, to utilize, but I'm glad it's not all that obvious to people. It's more sort of something that I kind of build upon to go where I want to.
It's like the
go where the poem takes me.
music or something. It's like a music, a musical ensemble in which there is a rhythm, a bass line, but you don't specifically listen to the bass line. It's there informing the melody, so.
That's a great analogy. Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby, for sharing that. All right, then. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts and your comments in the chat as well. I've shared links and info to Kathleen's books and upcoming classes as well. Please save the chat to save the info, or simply copy paste it on your Word doc or notes. And Kathleen, thank you once again. I feel so enriched, and I'm really happy you've enjoyed this experience and sharing in this space tonight.
Yes, thank you very much, Monica. I hope to see you in person, and many of you on the Zoom, see you in person soon. I'm glad that life is opening up again and we can be in real space together. And I'm so happy to be here on Zoom with you too. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, the pleasure is all mine, and I'll invite you at the end of our open mic segment for a closing poem. Kathleen, if you would be staying back longer, usually we end by 8:40, 8:45, but tonight we are going a little longer, so I'll be extending that open mic segment. So I hope you'll be online when I check in with you again.
Sure.
All right, then. With that, we are going to stop recording this segment. Those of you who are in the Zoom room, please stay online for the open mic segment of the evening. To the YouTube audience, thanks for joining in, and hope to see you for next month's virtual Belmont Poetry Night. Good night.